So first of all, this portfolio is an instance of a portfolio, but of course they take all different shapes and sizes and forms. I wasn't on the ref sub-panel, so you have to know that, but one of the sub-panelists from the last exercise was opining that it would be perfectly possible to submit the work in whatever form it's kind of made lastingly available, and the 300-word statement without anything else. So it's possible. I think possibly risky, and it also clearly depends on the nature of the work. This is very different, so this is a portfolio that's got sort of various bits of context and so forth. So it's an instance, you might not like it, or it might open up some other questions, or also allow you to think in parallel about other ways of doing things. However, I was quite pleased to get the whole thing together in the end, not least because we paid someone else to make a multimedia PDF, who I think did a fantastic job. So it's in a PDF form, and that's one of the things I therefore sort of am modelling here. And I suppose the other thing that is perhaps relevant to say, I mean, I probably should say, I've no idea how this did, so it may not have done well at all, so you need to know that as well. In the internal exercise, the review exercise before we finalised our submission, that meant that this went out to an external, it was rated 4-star/3-star. I don't see this as a 4-star portfolio, but I should also mention that, say that in that exercise at least it was deemed to be not entirely unworthy. So anyway, without further ado, this is a project that started with an approach to a production of The Tempest. And if I go to the menu, so Sebastian, who put the PDF together, I mean obviously I decided the structure and then gave him the materials. So I've organised this by way of the 300-word statement at the top, obviously, and then a section of what I would see as primary materials that evidence the research inquiry and its findings, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And then some supporting evidence that just really, that one is in effect saying to the panellists who, for all we know, spend 15 or 20 minutes on each item. In effect, I'm saying to the panellists, you don't have to read this stuff, but here it is to prove that this thing happened in Poland or wherever else. And then Sebastian made these elements linkable, so I should be able to click on this and go to a page and then go back to the menu, which I thought was helpful. So if I bring up the 300-word statement, and I'll just let you read that.
And more. You might be a bit blind, you may have to expand it.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, it's the hours of the computer.
Is that sufficient?
Thank you.
Or I could read it, you can read it yourselves. And shall I scroll? So just to say a couple of words about this, I know you've done some work this morning on the 300-word statement, which of course is a completely key and crucial bit of document. So I just wanted to go in here with, in effect, the headline. This this research, not the production project per se, but the research is about exploring whatever it's exploring. What's my relationship to it? So I may have been the sound designer, I may have been a performer, I may have been a dramaturg. In this instance, I conceived a project and directed it through its various iterations. I did that working with other people, so their work clearly is vital to this and they need to be mentioned. The research has an overarching question and then a subsidiary question. In some ways I only knew what the questions were at the end of the project and putting this together, although we can reflect more on questions in a minute. The research has its process, so the statement just outlines briefly the process. And the research, if it is research in ref terms, which we'll come on to again after I've gone through the portfolio, you discover something. So I think it's incumbent on us to at least point in the 300-word statement to what the research discovered, what's the new knowledge. So I've tried to summarise this in a sort of condensed way at the end of the statement. So that's the statement, and then we get into the section looking at what actually happened. And for me, a completely key document here, which is entirely an effort of the documenting process, is to sketch the trajectory in the timeline, but then also in a way to force myself to reflect on how the research was going and where it deviated or got closed off, or where I dropped something and pursued something else in doing that. So I would, in putting this pretty much front and top, and if I had more words in the 300-word statement, looking back at this, I think I should have pointed the reviewers to read this document first. But in effect, the portfolio is saying, read this first. So the project started with this workshop production that we developed at Central for a week. We then developed it further at the Gdansk Shakespeare Festival for a week, and we showed sort of work in progress, kind of showcase, which was in effect a 1-hour production at the festival. And there was a concept for the production, but of course the concept can also be modelled as a research inquiry. So the concept was, instead of just doing the play by bringing all of the scenes into the stage, to literally give Prospero his central cell, which is a kind of median nerve centre from which he can see everything. So the audience sees that, and then various other scenes from the play take place elsewhere in either that larger space or elsewhere in the venue and get mediated in. So it's partly to do with how surveillance operates and how we can reconceive space and spatial relation in contemporary performance, but I hope honouring what is intrinsic to the play. Anyway, so that was that project. So what I've suggested in the research trajectory column is that, having done that, we arrive at some insights, however banal or partial they might appear. Tell me if you want me to expand any of this. Sorry?
Please do.
Okay, I don't necessarily want to pick through this in too much detail, but maybe this first one is relevant, just to give you a sense. So I'm saying this is when it happened, this is what it was, and with whom. This is how I look at this in terms of the research line of inquiry, and if you want to see the evidence for this work, go to B2 or C1. Okay, so as part of this whole project, we did a workshop with students, which, as I've said here, wasn't designed to contribute to the research process. However, in doing it, there was one little thing that I thought, yeah, that's quite interesting what they're doing there, so we'll perhaps explore that later on. So that sort of just became part of the more organic development of this. So then this is where this may now differ from some other projects that are more squarely, completely geared around the practice. I then did some conference presentation around this, did some more workshopping, and wrote a journal article. I don't normally write about my work, and I think it's normally preferable if other people write about your work, and particularly in the public domain. But because this was only on for a week, we didn't subsequently do that production project or realise it anywhere else, and for a couple of other reasons as well. I decided it would be interesting to try to write about this, so I did write a journal article. So I'm describing here what the article is doing and how the article in itself is fleshing out some of the sort of gnawing away at issues to do with surveillance and arguably beginning to theorise those in a way that wouldn't necessarily have been evident in the performance per se. And then I did another conference paper and published that in a sort of French-Chinese journal. So that's the array of works.
And is it okay to have one question?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
If you were, let's say, to do this production again, after writing this paper, the practice research workshop, etc., obviously this production would have changed, probably. Would you then list it as a separate on your research on this table thing? Would you list it separately and commented on how it's changed?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so, because if we had, we were going to do a production in London at the, is it the Vaults, at the point, and it was accepted and then the Vaults were closed. So we didn't get to do it. But I thought, well, that's okay, and I sort of submitted this anyway because I thought there was enough gathered stuff for it to be a coherent inquiry. But had we made that production, then yes, that would have been, actually a culmination of not just the Poland iteration, but some workshopping that we did with some specific technologies that we hadn't used in Poland. So we would have brought all of that together in a public production. So yes.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
So this workshop, item number 6 here, is the workshop that we did at Surrey. Which got a little bit of EPS, very modest funding, but it enabled us to do, I think, 3 days? Oh no, a week, looking at using some specific technologies. Anyway, so here is now the reflection on the production, and rather than show a video or even show a video edit, I decided just to use some stills and do a kind of, not quite storyboard treatment, but you have stills with some very, very moderate commentary. Partly because the portfolio is quite big, and also because I kind of wanted to give the reviewers as immediate access as possible and make the thing feel as user-friendly as possible and not feel that you've got to dive in very much or wade through an awful lot, and also because it was a workshop production, so I'm not making grand claims for production values or anything. So the imperative here is always to be talking about what is being inquired into and what's being discovered as a consequence. So maybe this one's a case in point. So if you can't read the text, these images show Prospero in his cell engaging in conversation by remote means with Ferdinand and Miranda, who are co-present in the space on a different part of the stage, but notionally outdoors. we explored the spatial logic of conducting an eye-to-eye conversation simultaneously in two separate areas by way of performance to and through the screen, and the panoptic logic that this entails. So I'm sort of attempting to tie this in with arguments that then pitch up in the article as well about surveillance. So that's that. So this is the article. So I've copied in the article here, but again on the advice of one of the sub-panel members who came and before everything kicked off, came and did a workshop at Surrey. I've just highlighted bits of the article, so I'm not saying to people that you've got to wade through all of this. I'm saying if you read this bit's relevant, and so is this. So I've just pulled out some things, and then it lands in something close to the very end, but not quite at the very end. So again, in a way, it's the article isn't the main thing in and of itself. The main thing is how this fits in the research trajectory. So what did we discover from our workshop exploration? The surveillance modes and habits of the 21st century don't quite match those, but there are some resonances, and we discovered some things, and if we were to do this in future, what we would do is potentially explore this. So it's not rocket science, and you might think it's banal, and it might actually not be of huge value, but the effort at least is to try and place this within a trajectory and show where it's got to and how and why, and therefore where it might be pointing to. So that's that. And then just other little bits. These are all links. A couple of these are now defunct as the websites haven't been sustained, but there's one that I opened here where we did make, in order to make sense of the work that we did at Surrey. Oh, is this playing? It should be playing, yeah.
Raven's feather from an unwholesome fen drop on you both!
So it may or may not be artistically interesting, but we're exploring very deliberately some specific different surveillance technologies. The video just collapses a bunch of work together to evidence that, and then I've included in the Section B materials, the end of project report in relation to the EPSRC funding, that says, here's what we originally aimed to do. This is the summary of the outcomes of this particular workshop and what we think we've discovered from it. And then lastly in this section I've included the conference paper that I gave in Shanghai, which gathers all of the reflections together across the project as a whole. So I would see that as, in effect, a summative reflection. I don't think I highlighted any of that. It's a relatively short paper. And then all of the rest is just the documentation stuff. So it's not particularly interesting necessarily, but it sort of proves that the thing existed in the manner in which I say it existed. So that's that. And now I propose to move into a slightly broader view discussion, unless you have any particular questions on that.
I do.
Yeah.
Sorry. So in the publicity material, did you include only publicity material you produced and the festival in Gdańsk produced, or also the publicity material that were generated later, so I don't know, any reviews or anything like that?
Yeah, there weren't any reviews of the work, otherwise I would have included it.
You would have included it.
Yeah, and I would have talked about it in section B if it had been relevant to the research. Or I might even have included that in section B if it was saying things that chime with what the research inquiry is. But otherwise, no, I just included the festival's publicity. I presented on this in a conference in Chicago, and there's a massive brochure, so I just included stuff from that brochure as well. But I mean, there's no reason anyone would want to read any of that. But I think that the duty to prove that you do what you say you do is just what lies behind this.
Thank you.
So this is also what Lauren asked me to do. So here are some reflections. First of all, on the research aspect of something submitted to REF. So of course a lot of what I'm going to say here is now very historical, and the exercise will change and we don't yet quite know how, and of course it will have its guidelines and they might reshape this. But looking back at the last exercise and the guidelines that informed us in making submissions to the last one, first of all, it's explicit. The research outputs that are submitted must be the product of research. And I think for practitioners, and particularly for people who are doing what might be thought of as near industry or professional practice, the challenge is to represent not necessarily the project but the research. And perhaps therefore the challenge is to know that the project has research. And then I think this definition is hugely useful. For the purposes of the REF, research is defined as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. And as a sort of, in effect, a kind of institution, or one of the institution's many managers of research, I sort of had that inscribed on my forehead, really, that because it's so useful. And once you start to think about your work in those terms, it just makes certain kinds of activity or ways of thinking just imperative. The guidelines also say that research includes a whole bunch of things that are comforting to us as practitioners and people in the creative and performing arts. But it includes them expressly where these lead to new or substantially improved insights and involve perhaps new or substantially improved materials and processes and so forth. So again, it becomes incumbent on us to demonstrate through this exercise what is either the new and improved knowledge, insight, and or the new and improved process. And I think, for all that one is aiming at the world-leading 4-star stuff, it is never always going to be earth-shattering. These things will all also inevitably be incremental. And then the sort of comforting bit in the last guidelines was this inclusion of, but not limited to, new materials, devices, images, artifacts, products, reports, IP, performances, exhibits or events, and so forth. The guidelines indicate that the portfolio is, the submissible element in cases where the research output's ephemeral. It's one in a series of interconnected works, or it can't fully represent its dimensions through the evidence either in the output and or the statement. So the case that I was attempting to make with my portfolio is that there was a line of inquiry that wasn't captured in any single output there, but that could be thought of as a broadly interconnected line of inquiry. So hence the portfolio becomes necessary. The material must be sufficiently substantial to constitute evidence which will allow the sub-panel members to access the research dimensions of the work. It's likely to include complementary evidence, but it should be presented with the sole purpose of assisting the panel members to access fully the research dimensions of the work. So the research focus is always imperative, unless they change the scheme, which they probably won't for the next ref. So the portfolio should, arguably, schematically, it should evidence the investigation, which brings us to the question, or the challenge, or the need to know, the process, the event itself, the outcome, whatever the artifact or the thing that's put into the public domain is. But critically, and I think, like looking at other work, consulting or whatever, previously, I think sometimes this is the bit that's lost or left out. What are the insights from this research? And how does the portfolio evidence the effective sharing? So if you think back to that little tag definition of what research is new knowledge, new insights, a process of inquiry leading to new insights effectively shared. So the portfolio will demonstrate that sharing to good effect has taken place. So I suppose one might argue that can happen in a conference, or of course through a public performance or public exhibition or concert. And there might be other ways in which insights are shared. So that's that. Okay, so how to plan to do this? So because we take the academic shilling and we're kind of in this game, for all that we may also be creative artists and performers and practitioners, we are presumably also people who are submitting to REF, or prospectively submitting to REF. And for that to be the case, it seems to me that in any project that may be or become refable, one can think right from the outset as to how it might be phased in order to really be geared around inquiry, at least in some manner of it, and be geared to the effective sharing of new knowledge, aside from just effective public performance. I think some kind of articulation of therefore what the research is, and arguably what the findings are, is useful. So certainly what the research is first off. So I'm just developing something with Tom Armstrong actually, and Trio Aporia, who play period instruments. And we've done a little bit of workshopping, but Tom and I and Stephen Preston have shared some initial research questions. I mean, you'd never do this, presumably, if you were just doing a sort of practice project. But to get ourselves into an arguably good habit, we thought, okay, we are what we really want to gnaw at here, or where we want to come up with something, is in X, Y, and Z areas. So we've parked some research questions. If and as and when this becomes a research entry for Tom or myself, or perhaps Stephen as well, we can go back to those and remodel those, or show how they get changed. So there begins to be an arc to the inquiry. And then, of course, the documentation one can catch en route. I did go to a great presentation by someone on the video documentation of rehearsal work, whose technique is just to turn the camera on for 3 minutes max during a workshop, or 2 or 3 hour or half day engagement, so that you're not left with the map of the world that's the same size as the world that you just can't pick through. So if you're really, really strategic and you ask very careful or pointed questions, or only record some small amount of stuff, you have much less to work with, but that just probably gives you more time in your life. But on the other hand, factoring in points at which you catch some materials, take some photos, it's precious. So in making the plan for what the research project is, that I'm sort of mooting here, consider framing it as an inquiry rather than simply a performance or a project. Consider how the line of research is going to be evidenced. Perhaps consider a multimodal portfolio submission that includes diverse bits and pieces that make it really easy for a reviewer to see how the trajectory goes. Of course, we know that the statement is critical, but then what I also want to land with here is that just taking some time to play back to the reviewers what has been discovered. I mean, really, that's why there's all of this anxiety about auditing the stuff in the first place. What's the public money for? It's to produce things that go into the public domain and have benefit. So what is it that we have offered and discovered here?